All right, raise your hand. I feel like everyone is channeling their inner, every moderator is channeling their inner preschool teacher. But it's amazing that we have so many people who are staying with us for this, the penultimate panel. It's been a really rich day with a lot of food for thought. And like any rich meal, it better end with a great dessert. So I'm really excited to be sitting down with this group of leaders. There's been a day where I've really appreciated how almost everyone I've met over the course of the conference has been a builder in one way or another. Whether they're peace builders, tech builders, knowledge builders for our friends and colleagues from academia. And the recurring theme, or one of the recurring themes that came out even from Tristan's opening session last night was around polarization as the pollution inherent in business models built in the attention economy and the engagement algorithms. And as many of the folks in this room are here looking to build a new, not only build new projects and new products, but figuring out a way to make them viable in the long term for societies, it's an opportunity to really sit down with the people on the business end of things. And so our session today is going to focus on sort of funding, the funding of PeaceTech, the funding of social good, and we have a unique set of leaders here with me today, to whom I'm going to put the question, is it possible to do good, to do well, and most importantly to do big? Because the problems we've been talking about are big problems, and we have some promising solutions, many of them small. And so I think for anything to get big, the business model has to come into play. And so that's our topic today, and there's no one better qualified to discuss it than these four leaders. Let me introduce them quickly, and I'll kick some questions over. We have Sheldon Himelfarb, founder of PeaceTech Lab, one of the leading NGOs, cutting-edge thinking in this space. We have Betsy Hoover, founder of Higher Ground Labs, one of a small but high-impact, social impact VC firm. Anamitra Deb, managing director over at Omidyar, and Paul, who leads the incubator at the Grebel incubator over at University of Waterloo. So it's a really great conversation to have with four people from four really different backgrounds. But I want to start with you, Sheldon. I think a lot of people look at public good and they think about public provision of those goods and public funding. You've been through, you were from where you sit at PeaceTech Lab, you both have seen the strengths and limitations of public funds in this space. You lead an NGO that works with corporate and foundations and other kinds of actors too. So I want to start with you, and maybe you could kick us off with sort of the role that you see public funds and public-based business models playing in PeaceTech future.
Great, thanks. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you, Mike. I will try to be brief, recognizing we're in that dangerous place between all of you and Friday happy hour. But I have to begin by thanking the organizers. You guys have done a brilliant job of just such a informative, valuable day, and you've had such smarts to hold the money talk for last. That keeps everybody around. So you ask about the role and limitations of public funding, and well, first of all, I don't think I can do much better than quoting Colin from Polis yesterday, who was talking about government procurement. You might recall at the end of yesterday, he says, you know, you get into this business and you're excited about the mission, and then you end up being a procurement geek. And so true. There's so much bureaucracy involved. But then again, you know, seriously, we all know every single kind of funding has its strings attached, has its problems, whether it's public or private or VC or corporate or foundation. They all have issues. And I have to say, when it comes to the public funding, that the work the PeaceTech Lab was doing in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, South Sudan, where we were working to provide low-cost, off-the-shelf tech tools, tech training, tech strategy to local change makers, that work probably wouldn't have been possible without public funding. There just were not a whole lot of folks lined up to give us money to do that. So that's the virtue of the public funding. But at the same time, when I was previously with the U.S. Institute of Peace, before we spun out the PeaceTech Lab, I was also very mindful that those funds are limited, that the budget for the United States Institute of Peace, the entire budget was about $40 million to do everything that the Institute was doing, which at that time, about 10 years ago, just as we were spinning out the PeaceTech Lab, at that time, that was less than the catering budget for Google. So their chicken budget exceeded the budget for the nation's Center for Conflict Management and Peacebuilding, which is why we turned to looking for other sources of funding, why we spun out the lab. And we had some successes in getting big tech money, in getting VC money for our PeaceTech Accelerator program, for our risk analytics program, and for other things. But I think that gives you a sense of the breadth, the limitations, the bureaucracy, the slow-moving nature of public funding, but at the same time, the virtues. It helps you do things you couldn't do otherwise, but it doesn't begin to tap into the order of magnitude that we were hoping to tap into when we spun the lab out from the Institute. And there, I don't know whether it was our own incompetence at really trying to raise those big private dollars. I don't know whether it was our incompetence or whether it was we came face to face with the reality that for-profit means for-profit. And I'm happy to talk more about that as we go.
Well, I think that's a great segue in terms of for-profit means for-profit. Let's kick it. Let's bring it on, Betsy. Let's talk about for-profit for good, for impact, and especially leading one of the leading VC firms in this space. How do you see PeaceTech, and if we talk about some of the harms being incentives that maybe don't contribute to social cohesion, how do you try and find incentives in commercial and financial incentives to build things better?
Yeah, thanks. How about this? Okay. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and I've just met so many awesome people today that I didn't know before, so I appreciate all the conversations. I'll give just a little bit of context on Higher Ground Labs, and that will just inform my comments here. We are a small VC firm. We've been around for about 5 years. Our mission in our founding was to fund progressive political technology. So our portfolio is basically the technical infrastructure for democratic campaigns, progressive organizations, and like the progressive movement. We have recently expanded our mission to look at the role that tech can play in promoting, saving, redirecting democracy. And we've done that because just the needs have changed. That is the biggest crisis of the moment. And yes, we need to elect great leaders. I have an opinion on who those are. But that doesn't really matter if we don't have a functioning democracy, and that's what's in crisis right now. And so we're in the process of redirecting our fund and raising with this kind of new mission at heart. So that's kind of where I show up today. And there's a role for all types of funding in this space, and all of it is needed, in my perspective. The reason that I see private capital and VC in particular as having a role is really threefold. One, I think startup culture brings a different level of rigor and rapid innovation than other types of funding. And yeah, it is some of the incentives behind the investor that drives that. It's also the way resources are used, the way resources are gained, and then the way resources are spent. So I think that there's some advantages there. Second is scale. Actually, one of my mentors, when I was thinking through with my team starting this new fund, said, we need to do what they did for climate for democracy. Right? Like we're seeing all this activity in climate right now, and so much of that is because founders figured out a way to align better climate outcomes with pocketbooks. and suddenly dollars flew. And companies were able to scale really quickly and make a difference. We're not there yet, but make a difference in how individual consumers live their lives. We need to figure out how to do that with democracy, and we need to figure out how to make it, how to align incentives to make democracy healthier rather than the role tech has played in democracy in the past, which is maybe eroding it a bit. But third, if you're going to use private dollars in this space, then we need to put some guardrails in place to make sure that the mission stays core to the companies that we're investing in. And we do have experience doing this on the political side. So we see doing that with board seats. We see doing that in clear governance, like rules and red lines. We see some poison pills and transitions of power that we put in place at the beginning, very early stages of these companies to help keep them on track for the mission that they set out for. And so I think if we know that private dollars are a piece of the puzzle here, we need to build companies that are working in this space in a way that protects the mission that we're all here for, the mission that our fund's here for, and allows us to grow with that vision in mind.
Awesome. Well, thanks. And maybe kicking it over and picking it up from there, kicking it over to you, Anamitra. We heard there's a role for there's a role for all kinds of funding in the space, but I think no funds are more sought after than philanthropic support. And so, you lead the responsible tech portfolio at Omidyar, and I'd love to just hear sort of where you see the role of philanthropy alongside public funding, alongside VC funding, and especially what you see as some of like the key niches that you care about in this space.
Thank you, and thanks first of all for having me here. When Lisa first reached out, I wasn't sure that the work we did was really sort of peace tech or social cohesion work, but the more time I've spent listening to the amazing conversations, the more I'm convinced that it both is a part of that work and it needs to be a part of that work. So thank you for having me. Philanthropy is, and Sheldon was saying this about the catering budget, philanthropy is quite similar. It's actually an incredibly fragmented institution. The US annual spend on philanthropy is about the same as the social media ad revenue budget, but that goes to a few firms. There's 108,000 private foundations in the US. That's more than the total number of dry cleaners and the total number of coffee shops combined. Okay? Unlike in the free market, here collective action, cooperative action, aligned action would no doubt be a lot better for the outcomes we seek, right? So I think one of the big questions we always think about, and we're not representative of all philanthropy, no one can be, there's 108,000 of us just in the US, is what can we do to do things differently than they've been done before? And broadly, our answer comes down to one statement, which is the playing field is not equal, and so it's incumbent upon us, who are beneficiaries of that playing field, to tilt the playing field towards better outcomes for everybody, right? For a better society, for a healthier and just society, for a more flourishing democracy, for better public conversation, for all of the things that we've been talking about today. And to not evade the question, to answer Mike's question directly, we also think about 2 or 3 ways in which we can do that. One, I think, is philanthropy has the luxury of taking the long view, right? We don't have to think about the system as it is today. We have the luxury of reimagining different systems and having a vision for other ways in which the defaults could change, the prevailing ideas and mindsets could change, and then aligning our funding towards those new and reimagined and alternative mindsets and beliefs, right? It can be a different world. Someone needs to take the long view. We don't have accountability to markets, really to anybody. So one of the benefits of that is to be able to take the long view. A direct benefit of that actually is to be able to support the champions, the advocates, the researchers, the ethicists, the civil society that actually is outlining the ideas and the innovations that can actually make that new thing happen. So one of the roles that we play at Omidyar, especially with the responsible tech work, with our bridging capital work, et cetera, is to make sure that we are supporting and catalyzing new ideas, new frameworks, new approaches. We don't have the kind of budgets to make things scale, again, to the earlier point, but we do have the kind of budget to support new organizations when they're first starting out, or new ideas when they're first starting out, or new leaders when they're first starting out. So that's something we really pay attention to, and some of the people we've supported are in this room today. We're really proud of their work. And then finally, I think innovation is really critical, but someone has to de-risk innovation, especially when the markets won't support it. And I think one of the key roles that philanthropy can play is to de-risk innovation. We call it, Google couldn't build the search engine if somebody hadn't built the internet. And the internet was a publicly built commons. And so we call that priming the pump. Someone has to prime the pump so that great innovators can succeed. It's the job of us to prime that pump. It's the job of us to de-risk innovation. So I think one of the ways in which we can really step up is to do that as well.
Thanks. And coming over to you, Paul, I think one of the adages is putting the right money for the right product in the right project, and making sure that as people are building, and as the innovators that you mentor and lead through your incubator are building their products, building their projects, starting up their businesses or their nonprofits, that they're aligning themselves to something that'll be viable in the long term that can scale. And so I was wondering, what kind of advice do you have for people, those in the room? What's the advice you give to your students, to your mentees, about how you actually go about thinking about turning not only a great idea or a great technology or a great approach into something that actually is transformative and actually will scale and sustain?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for the question, and to you and your colleagues at Search, and Lisa and all the others who've organized this gathering. Maybe before talking specifically about advice around funding, I should just want to make an observation based, again, on the context I'm coming from. So some of you may not be familiar with the University of Waterloo and the Canadian tech ecosystem, but I'm privileged to be able to work with a really vibrant entrepreneurial community that's home to thousands of tech startups. My university itself has a variety of incubator programs for hundreds of startups, and I get to work with like a few dozen who are really interested in peace and justice related impacts. But I've noticed over the past 8 years a profound shift in the student interests and ambitions more broadly, far beyond those who might find their way into our program. And I think it's really exciting. And an important, I guess, observation or comment to share in the context of a gathering like this is that, yes, we need funding. We also need talent. and I guess I'd be here to assure you that there's a lot of really amazing talent eager to make a contribution to the agenda of a gathering like this. Really bright, really motivated, really committed and ambitious engineers and computer scientists. So that's just one first observation. Really at the core of I think the vibrancy of what happens at Waterloo, and something that I try and reflect also with people who are most socially minded or driving toward social impact, social entrepreneurship, and peace building more specifically, really resonates with the broader theme in our ecosystem that again was mentioned earlier today. Is you need to focus on building things that people actually want. There are important problems in the world, and a lot of students are deeply committed and motivated to trying to address those problems, and they have big ambitions around what they might do. But first and foremost, you need to be, again, focusing on your customer. And in the context of peace and justice related startups, that means often getting to know NGOs, getting to know people working in government, who the end customer typically is, and building relationships early on, not as an afterthought, but early on in your ideation, in fact. And so long before people actually find their way into our program with a startup, they have an established relationship. They have a proof of concept that they've tested with a real person in the real world. And again, and maybe this is not news to many of you in this room, but there's a lot of innovation theater that happens in universities. And I would say that, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but in my particular context, there's not a lot of latitude or interest in that. It's about building real stuff, building early, and again, responding to the needs of customers. Because, again, investment follows revenue is a larger mantra, and if you're going to require investment to scale. You're going to have to demonstrate, again, the ongoing viability of a longer-term pathway toward revenue. Now, that's great in principle. In practice, and again, we can maybe get into this in the conversation, there are lots of challenges in that regard. And I think, in fact, partly why I'm here is that I'm really excited to see how a larger conversation between tech and peace building and the funding community can help recalibrate expectations and assumptions among the potential customers for projects in a program like mine around what it costs to build tech. How that is very resource intensive, long before the prospects of the longer term impact that everybody's seeking. And so it's not that there are straightforward and easy answers. And in fact, often what I'm doing with people in our program is telling them cautionary tales, warning them about the challenges they experience. And again, lots of anecdotes I could share around that, about the misalignment around understandings and expectations, timelines, that students and recent graduates need to be cognizant of. And so, yeah, I spent a lot of time talking about what hasn't worked and why, as much as here are some opportunities and reasons why you might want to, again, find a way forward. Yeah, and then I guess maybe the last thing I would say is and again, this was alluded to by others too, in that journey of trying to build something that somebody wants, really finding a way of centering your real core purpose, mission, desired impact, because it's very easy to lose sight of that. And lots of examples, again, that I've seen through our program and others where the opportunity that takes someone in a different direction ends up distracting from a larger impact. And then maybe just the final thing, these are big problems we all care about. I guess I also tell students to not dwell on scale early on. Scale is maybe sometimes overrated. There can be really impactful, sustainable ventures operating at a relatively small level. And again, scale follows demonstration of impact. So you don't know where that might end up, but don't dwell on scale at the outset.
Thanks. I think that's really, let's round of applause. No, I think that's really great. And I know from listening to all of you, it's definitely triggered a number of questions for me. But one that I wanted to kick out to the group is I think most of us are aware access to capital, access to funding is challenging for almost everyone in the space. It's front of mind for a lot of builders and founders. But some people have more difficulty in accessing than others. And so I would be really curious about how the different ways that your organizations are approaching inclusion, people from around the world, people from founders, builders from underrepresented backgrounds, and what are some of the particular challenges they might have, but also some of the ways that you guys are also helping to extend capital and extend opportunity. And that's open to the group.
Well, I'm just reminded of what Anamitra was saying about how foundations prime the pump, because we have a major initiative underway, and we have a consortium of 6 wonderful funders, wonderful foundations. But what I've seen is their emphasis on ensuring that our leadership teams are diverse, that we are looking for global South participation. I think they're asking lots of really good, hard questions that has enormous potential for leveling that funding playing field. And I just, it's something I actually had not seen previously. It feels very, very new and very sincere and determined. Like, we won't get the funding if we don't make sure that we meet these requirements.
Yeah, happy to follow up on that. I think this is one of the hardest things, because I think philanthropy itself, in some ways has a guilt complex, right? We're not sure if we should be around. And sometimes you feel like the best thing you can do with good philanthropy is to put yourself out of business over time by actually giving away the money and the power to people who can actually use their expertise and capabilities to do the real work. That said, we have a role in the interim, right? So how do we do that role well? It's what we call the how of philanthropy that Sheldon's referring to. And some of that how of philanthropy is to intentionally, therefore, identify ways in which you're diversifying how you give money and who you give money to, and how that's made available. And we've tried any number of things. I mean, I think I can talk about 2 or 3 experiments. One is to ensure that, leadership teams and management teams themselves are diverse and representative of the communities they're trying to help. That's a relatively new thing. It's important. The other thing is to ensure when you're running prizes or competitions or challenge grants or what have you, that you've intentionally designed to get very global, diverse, representative candidates. And if you don't meet a certain bar, you don't actually go ahead until you've got that bar, and you keep going until you get there. And then the third thing is to make sure that, you have the people who know the problems best, not just as part of your partners, but also as part of your staff. Right? There's no substitute, sorry, for having people who've actually been on both sides of the philanthropic equation on your staff, who've been advocates, who've been supported by philanthropy, actually being on your staff and being able to work with the networks they bring in. Those are usually sometimes the best sources of diversified networks and doing philanthropy differently. So again, lots to learn. Hugely open to ideas. I don't think anyone's got this right yet, but as long as we feel like we're making progress, that's probably the most important thing we can do. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add on, I do think this is one of the most difficult things, and it's something that we as a fund have every year renewed our commitment to and experimented with different ways to just make sure we have leadership teams that are representative of the communities that we're serving and of the country or world, or well, we're doing U.S. politics, so it's mostly country. But the biggest thing in my mind is, just making sure our leadership team and then the partners that we work with in and out of our investing cycle are diverse and represent people from all different parts of our movement. And that is then part of how we build pipeline, part of how we source companies, part of where our marketing goes and who knows about us, and also part of who is, we do very early stage funding. So part of it is also who's getting the message that yes, you can start a company and yes, we will fund it, right? Who are the people being told yes, you belong here. And so we haven't gotten this right. I wish our portfolio was much more diverse than it is. But I think we are definitely committed to it and have had some interesting experimentation in how we get there.
Thanks. And Paul, I wanted to actually pick you up something you hinted at earlier around this question about scale. Of course, you said impact before scale. But as I was reflecting on a lot of the examples that we've heard over the course of these past 2 days, many of the paths to impact and scale involved peace tech projects, peace tech organizations, often quite small, achieving that through partnerships, through alliances, whether with big industry players, often who have a whole wide set of complex interests in this question, or with government actors who are also quite powerful and also have a wide and complex set of interests, and both of them also have the financial resources to maybe take it to scale. So I was wondering how you advise the groups you work with to navigate some of the power, the money's power. So how do they sort of navigate some of the power dynamics, the interests dynamics, and sort of achieve scale in a way that's cognizant and aware of some of the wider institutional dynamics at play on these issues?
Yeah, great question. I think, again, just to acknowledge, it feels like somebody referred to this as a movement. It feels like it's early stages in the movement, right? And so I don't know if I have lessons to draw from concrete experiences in that regard, other than to say we do emphasize systems thinking in how we are working with early stage entrepreneurs. So understanding, being able to map the system they're trying to engage in, even if their point of leverage might be, a relatively small component of it. Being able to, again, think systemically and act institutionally is a really important skill set. And to be honest, I feel like here too, we've had a lot of really remarkable peace entrepreneurs who have been able to get up to speed really quickly in that regard, with minimal amount of direction and guidance. And we've been wondering about how we can do a better job, in part to ensure accessibility, to a broader array of students from a broader array of backgrounds, to be able to equip them to do that as well, as again, those success stories that we've seen. But yeah, if that's clear. But recognizing, again, you're always going to be a part of a much more complex and larger system, and understanding your role within that is definitely an important piece of the equation.
Awesome. You hinted earlier, and I wanted to pick up and maybe tease it out of all of our panelists today. But this has been one of the more upbeat or sort of optimistic conferences I've been a part of. So I want to maybe start with you, Sheldon. As you look ahead, what makes you, and then we'll sort of come around, but I'd like to know, sort of as a final thought, sort of what's one thing that makes you optimistic about this space, or option A. Option B, what's one thing you're working on that you're especially excited for in 2023 and beyond?
Well, I'm really excited by what I've seen here, but not necessarily for the reasons that you think. I'm excited because it seems clear from the discussion across the last 2 days that we are recognizing this tsunami of a problem that we are facing. That there is a real sense of urgency. And then I'm excited because I think what we've seen here is a tsunami of innovation. So if with these two things, if the innovation piece can meet the urgency of the problem, which absolutely remains to be seen, that's encouraging.
So the urgency before the tsunami is a great. I don't know how optimistic it is, but it's certainly. But the energy is certainly there, and the mobilization is certainly there. So I really appreciate that. Maybe.
Yeah, I agree with that tsunami reference and all. Sorry, but I think the other side of that, like, I also raise money for my fund, so I'm deploying funds, but it's not my money. I'm raising money from other people. And it's a really hard fundraising environment right now, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room feel that for obvious reasons. But I see interest from funders in just a few areas where they will cast aside their cautious conservative nature, and this is one of them. When we say, well, we're going to put this money to work to think about the role of tech and democracy, people's ears perk up. And that's special right now. There's not a lot of spaces that are having that kind of reaction. And so I think that it adds to the urgency to be like, we've got to be ready to do something with that. There is energy, there is this mix of ideas, innovation, money, and momentum. And that's a really powerful combination. This is our time to really move that forward. And so I'm encouraged by that, and also a little on the edge of my seat, a little jittery, we got to go. This is our moment.
It's hard to build on this stuff. I had an old professor who used to say, the French wanted liberty, equality, and fraternity, and the French got Napoleon, right? And the lesson I want us all to take away from that is, in those intervening years, there was a lot of unrest, and there was a lot of mobilization. And I think unrest and mobilization, to the point we've made today about conflict that's desirable, or tensions that are important, or work that has to be done, I feel like we're in that moment right now, and it's incredibly energizing. It wasn't that way 5 years ago. I think 5 years ago we were naive. I think 5 years from now, if we're still naive and we're still unrested, that would be unfortunate. But from everything I've heard today, and everything I've seen, and everything I've been listening to, I'm really optimistic that the next 5 years are actually about good mobilization, good unrest, and driving towards solutions. I wouldn't have been able to say that 5 years ago, and that makes me really optimistic.
Well, just in addition to my enthusiasm for all the potential and there is out there for talent to help us address these problems, to help us think in new ways, because the people who created the problems aren't capable, I think, of coming up with the solutions we need. I guess I would say I'm also really excited about the potential that conversations like this have for transforming the broader sector of peace building. And so in addition to having a lot of entrepreneurial activity, Waterloo is home to the oldest peace studies program in Canada. And frankly, I think kind of some of the mentality and the approach to sparking innovation, to doing R&D when it comes to this intersection of peace building and technology could be really helpful for the field more broadly, and bringing a bit more gumption and a new kind of sensibility or a way of addressing challenges in peace building.
Thanks. And maybe one last question, put you on maybe put each of you on the spot. You memorably quoted your professor recalling Napoleon. I was wondering, as you look at people who've navigated this tricky space well so far, the challenges of funding, the challenge of building an organization, of sustaining change, who do you sort of admire that you've seen do it really well, do it really smartly, whether it's a portfolio company or a student or someone who's really used, really held true to their social purpose while building something that lasts? We can take a minute to think about that one. We can take that one over to Slack.
I'm just trying to remember the name of the company. It's a guy here in the valley. Actually, I just don't remember the name of the company. Beneficial Tech. I can't remember what it was, but he's Benetech. I'm a big admirer of what that. I'm simply saying I'm a big admirer of what he has accomplished in the creation of Benetech 20 years ago, and continued to stay true to devising tech for social good, but also scaling the resources available for it. I mean, that's what's so interesting. It's never he's taking on big challenges. They're expensive, to your point, Paul. The tech development costs a lot of money, but he's managed to do that in Benetech.
So my hesitancy is just like who to single out, because I don't want anyone to get offended. But maybe I'll single out Majid Mirza, who's a participant in our incubator program right now, in part because today he was named by the Globe and Mail in Canada one of Canada's top 50 change makers. And he's got a startup that's focused on helping, it's created a platform to enable private equity investors to evaluate and assess the ESG performance of their portfolio companies. Majid's motivated primarily by, again, larger concerns around social cohesion, globally, divides around race and religion, and he's finding a really practical, actionable way of embedding that agenda in an unlikely place.
Yeah, and again, 15 years of impact investing means I can't really call out any single person. But I will build on something, Paul, you said earlier about one of the key characteristics of the companies that have been really successful, or the organizations that have been really successful, is they focused on how to have impact at scale rather than how to be scaled themselves. And what that means is, for instance, if you're an ed tech and you're really good at curriculum development, then you should just be really good at curriculum development. And you should work with all the other schools and all the other places where that can actually get embedded into and become the intel inside of the curriculum that's taught at schools. But if you also try to branch out and build schools ahead of it, it's a totally different business. And so I think figuring out your end game, figuring out what really differentiates you, the companies that have really stuck to that, the organizations that have really stuck to that, we always tell the organizations we support, don't try and be everything to everyone. It's just not possible. If you have great research, be the place of the world's best research. And you can stop there and still be an amazing asset to the ecosystem. So that's the one thing that I would say.
Yeah, I'm also going to think a little bit like, I'm not going to single out a single company, though there are lots that are doing creative things. But 2 points I'll call out here that I think goes very well in our industry. One, I've seen so many companies structure themselves in interesting ways so they can take in different types of capital. So whether that's a for-profit owned by a nonprofit, and so they can take philanthropic money as well as for-profit investment, or a company with a C4 or a PAC that runs alongside of it that they can run program through, or they run into a funder who doesn't want to invest for-profit dollars, but does want to support their work. And so they find an organization that wants to use them, that they run, can run that money through. Like really creative, get your hands dirty approaches to how to make a limited amount of money stretch to sustain and like ultimately work towards the goals that these funders have set out for. So I think that's really encouraging and something I hope we can bring to this work. And then a second thing is, we have 65 companies in our portfolio, and one thing that really inspires me when I look at the way that they work, they really work together. Like, we spend a lot of time convening founders and convening startup teams, and they're all in this for the same reason. And so even though some of them compete around the edges for pieces of the market, they really lay a lot of that aside to decide to work together towards something bigger, that they can build something bigger together. And they create efficiencies for their business in that, but also create a lot of goodwill that goes a long way. So those are my two.
Thanks a lot. A cohesive community of companies working for good in society is a great place to end. For those of us following us online, please continue to take advantage of the comments on Facebook, to participate in the Pro-Social Design Slack channel, and certainly follow us on Twitter. Follow each of these organizations on Twitter and Google and everywhere else you know how to find them. But we'll take 10 minutes to jot down some thoughts to put on the board to discuss with our friends and colleagues around these tables, and we'll reconvene for our last session of final thoughts after the discussion and interaction break. Thank you again, and applause for our participants.